As Hashem, today's daf is Masefta Avodah Zarah, daf Yud Aleph, the Yud Gimel, and we're going to begin from the Mishnah on daf Yud Beis Omid Beis. So the Mishnah says like this: Ir sheyesh ba Avodah Zarah, a city that is celebrating a holiday for an Avodah Zarah. V'hoya ba chanuyas mu'utaris v'she'ena mutaris. There are some stores that are decorated. Let's say they're decorated with roses and myrtle branches, and there's some doors and some stores are not decorated with myrtle branches. So there's two problems over here. One, if you walk into the store that's decorated with myrtle branches, probably those myrtle branches and roses were serviced for the Avodah Zarah, and therefore by you smelling them, you are benefiting. You're actually having enjoyment from the Avodah Zarah. This is where Resh Lakish learns in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan is going to learn the Mishnah and saying when you go to a decorated store, it shows that they are aligned with giving their profits, some of their profits, towards the church, basically. And therefore, if it's a store that has these decorations, the holiday decorations, then it shows it's aligned and giving their profits to the church, and therefore you're not allowed to shop there. But if it's not decorated, you are allowed to shop there. So two understanding of the Mishnah. The question is, didn't we learn that even if they're not decorated, if there's a holiday in the city, how are you allowed to buy anything from a store, even if it's not decorated? So the answer is. So the answer to that question is that you're allowed to purchase from a guy, even if they're having the holidays that day, if it's a type of item that he would be sad selling. For example, buying a watch from him or cufflinks or something like that. So most sellers are very, sad to sell something that belonged to them. We're not talking even a store. So therefore, you're allowed to buy something. The easier to do business with the guy is to sell them an animal, that which will be used for the Avodah Zarah, or to buy something, let's say vegetables from them that they're so happy to get rid of. And because of that, you're going to cause them to go to the Avodah Zarah and give thank you. Hey, look, it's a lucky day. I was able to get rid of produce that would have spoiled anyway. But to buy something from them that something that could last, they'll be sad to sell it, and therefore you're allowed to buy it, but only from a store that's not decorated. Okay, that's what we're going to understand. So let's read it again. Ir sheyesh bo Avodah Zarah, a city that has celebrating an Avodah Zarah holiday. V'hoya bo chanuyas mutaris, and it has stores that are decorated with roses and myrtle branches, and some that are not decorated. This is the exact same story in Beit Sha'an. The Chachamim says, the ones that are decorated, you're prohibited from buying from that store. But those that are not decorated, you can buy in that store. That's what the Mishnah says. So Omer Rav Shimon Malakish said, Lo yishanu el mitaris beveret v'hadas, if they're decorated with roses and myrtle branches. You're benefiting from the smell, and therefore maybe these roses and myrtle branches were spread out over the Avodah Zarah. They were brought into the store, and you're having benefit from something that was brought as an offering for an Avodah Zarah. That's also to do. Al mutaris beperes, but if they just have fruits, right, and just fruits all over the store, you're allowed to buy from even that store, because there's nothing wrong, even if they will give some of their profits to the Avodah Zarah. You're not smelling anything by the fruits, and therefore there's nothing wrong if you buy something and the store owner gives some of the profits to the church. My timer, the pasuk says, you're not allowed to benefit anything from the spoils of Avodah Zarah. That's by Ir Anidachas. So the Torah tells you nehenahu dasa, to benefit from it, to keep it for yourself, that's usher. To smell something and benefit, that's prohibited. We go to Amid Aleph. Al mahana shari, but to give benefit, that is permitted. Permitted. Rabbi Yochanan Amar. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Afilim mutaris beperis nami aser." Even if the store has fruits and therefore you can't really smell anything, it would also be prohibited to buy something from that store, since their profits are going towards the church. Kal b'choimin nehena aser, just like you're not allowed to benefit from offerings, that something that was offered to the Avodah Zarah, Mahana, like Kolshkein, you're not allowed to give benefit, a profit to the Avodah Zarah. So certainly you're not allowed to give the benefit. So Meisvei, the Gemara asks a question against Rav Shlokish. Rav Shlokish says you're allowed to give benefit to Avodah Zarah. Rabbi Nosson says, Yonchayv the Avodah Zarah, the day that they would serve the Avodah Zarah, Menachas boyes emechas. The goyim used to lower the price, so that you didn't have to give them the profits. They would lower the price on items that you bought on the market during market day if they had a holiday. Machrizim b'ayman, they make an announcement and they say, Kol mi shenoitel Torah, v'niach b'roisha, anybody who takes this crown, an Avodah Zarah crown, a crown that was they had some roses that they used for the Avodah Zarah, and you place it on your head, uv'roish chamayre, and you put it on the head of your donkey, lich Avodah Zarah, to show your allegiance and honor to the deity. Yaniach lo yismechas, then you don't have to pay the taxes. You don't have to pay the profits. Then you're going to pay the higher price. Al yaniach lo yismechas, you're not going to get the lower price. You'll have to pay the extra. So Yehudish nimtzah sham ma'yaseh. If a Jew is found in that kind of a city, what should he do? So a Jew always wants to, get the cheaper price. Yaniach, should he put on the crown? Then you're benefiting from the Avodah Zarah, because you're going to smell the flowers from the crown. Lo yaniach, but if you're not going to put on that crown, and you're just going to pay the extra higher price, and thereby giving more profit to the Avodah Zarah, nimtza mahana, you're giving benefit to the Avodah Zarah. So how does that all square away? Mekan Amru. So here you already have the question, because the Brisa Rav Nosson was concerned that you're not allowed to give extra and give benefit to the Avodah Zarah, which seems to disagree with Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish says you are allowed to give and buy something even though you know the profit is going to the church. So this right over here would be a question against Rish Lakish. But the Brisa continues. Amru, they said, you can buy it, if you do business transaction and you purchase something in the marketplace where they're celebrating an Avodah Zarah. So behema, if you bought an animal, te'aker, you have to blemish it. Peres ksus v'chelim, and make it unusable. Peres, if you bought fruits, ksus, clothing, v'chelim, and other types of utensils, yerakfu, you should have them spoil or put them away so they become unusable. If you have money and metal utensils which will never soil and never go bad, so you can't keep them around forever, you bring them to the saltwater sea and dump it there. No ships ever go there, and nobody else will find it. Basically, you have to get rid of it. The Ezahu Iker, how do you maim an animal so that it becomes an unusable animal? You can't just kill it, and you can't just, it's tzar b'lechaim, and you can't make it a treifa, causing it to die very soon. You just remove its hind legs from the knee and bottom and towards the floor, and thereby making it very difficult for walking and very difficult to use this kind of an animal. So Kanani midas, we have a partial quote in the Brisa, Yaniach, if you put on that crown, then you're benefiting from the Avodah Zarah. Lo yaniach, but if you're not going to put on the crown, and therefore you're going to buy, paying the higher price and giving the profits to the Avodah Zarah. It's a mahana, you're going to give cause benefit to the Avodah Zarah. Here is the question. The question is, Resh Lakish said, Shimon ben Lakish says that you are permitted to give benefit to Avodah Zarah. You're allowed to buy something even though you know the profit is going to go to the church. Resh Lakish will hold this brisa was Rabbi Nosson, right? Rabbi Nosson Oimer, right over here. Rabbi Nosson says, but Resh Lakish is going to say, yes, that's one opinion. Pligi Rabbanon, the Rab Nosson, the rabbis argue against Rab Nosson and say you are permitted to give benefit to the Avodah Zarah. No, the Amri, and I hold Rabbanon the Pligi. I hold like the Rabbanon that disagree. So it comes out, according to Resh Lakish, there is a machlekes between Rabbanon and Rab Nosson whether you're allowed to give benefit to the Avodah Zarah. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan Sova like Pligi. Rabbi Yochanan holds there's no argument. Nobody holds that you can give benefit to the Avodah Zarah. Says the Gemara, like Pligi, are they not arguing? Are they not arguing? V'loi Pligi v'Tanya, we learned in the Brisa. You're allowed to go to a marketplace of goyim, and here this price is going to say mahana is mutter, like Rish Lakish. The Brisa says one is allowed to go to the marketplace of the goyim if they're celebrating an Avodah Zarah day, a holiday for the Avodah Zarah. For like you're allowed to purchase for them hema avodah mishpachos bought them masadas ukramim. You're allowed to buy animals, servants, slaves, houses, fields, vineyards from them that day, because the people that are selling it are actually going to feel bad that they have to sell something like that, and therefore you're not causing them enjoyment that day, that they'll go thank their Avodah Zarah. They'll feel bad that they're strapped for cash and they're forced to sell their homes, their fields. You're allowed to do a real estate transaction with them. The choisev, and you can write up the deed, and you can right away bring it to their courts, even though it looks like you're giving honor to their deity because it shows that you need their approval. It's as if you're saving something from their hands. In other words, it's if you're not going to do it, if you're not going to write it up, they'll always deny the sale, and therefore it's like saving yourself from a loss. Then a lot of times you're allowed to do things to save yourself from a loss. Let's say a person was a kohen, and the halacha of a kohen is that the Chazal made a gezerah that a kohen shouldn't go to Chutz La'aretz because the whole Chutz La'aretz is like one big cemetery, besafik, and therefore a kohen cannot be in a mitam himself lemesa. But mitam b'Chutz La'aretz, a kohen could go to Chutz La'aretz lodim l'ariman to handle a court case and to sue a guy if he owes him money, because the whole thing is Rabbanan. And the Rabbanan suspended their restriction in case of financial loss. So therefore, a kohen is allowed to go to Chutz La'aretz if he can't, settle the case in Israel. He can go to Chutz La'aretz and take up the lawsuit over there because he's saving himself from financial loss. The same way we say he's allowed to go to Chutz La'aretz to save himself of financial loss. He could actually even walk into a real cemetery to save himself from financial loss. What do you mean? A kohen could walk into a basic kvaros just to save himself some money. That's mitami yourself in Torah, and there's a law. So there's no permission for a kohen to violate a law d'oraisa. Ella means besa pras the rabbanon. It's a cemetery midrabanan. What's a besa pras? A besa pras was that there was one kaver, there was one grave, and somehow it was in a lone field, and they plowed up the field. So it's possible that the plow machine brought up some of the bone fragments, which are spread out over the field, and perhaps there's a bone fragment the size of a barley. So Chazal made a gezerah, a restriction that if you plowed up a field that had a grave, a kohen is not allowed to permit himself to walk on such a field. There's a limit in the size, but that's only Issa D'Rabbanan to go into such a field. But if the kohen needed to pass through such a field in order to attend the lawsuit to save himself a financial loss with goyim, he's permitted to do that. And he could even go to Chutz La'aretz and mitama himself midrabanan. Lil my Torah, if he has to go to learn Torah, at least he should marry a woman. In other words, he could go to Chutz La'aretz if he could find a better Rebbe and to marry a woman. These are the most important part of being a individual Jew. You have to be able to have the right teacher and get married. Amar Rabbi Yehuda made a restriction. Amosai, when could you leave Chutz La'aretz? When could you leave Eretz Yisrael to go to Chutz La'aretz to learn Torah? He has absolutely no rabbi to teach him in Israel. If he finds a rabbi in Israel, he's not allowed to leave Israel. But Rabbi Yossi is more lenient. Even if he has a rabbi to teach him in Israel, Yitama, you can go to Chutz La'aretz. He can go to Mitama himself. Not everybody could learn from everyone. There's certain rebbes that are geared for certain types of people, and if he can't find a rebbe that is appropriate for him in Eretz Yisrael, he's allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael to find the rebbe in Chutz La'aretz. Rabbi Yossi said, "Ma'aseh Yossi HaKohen, Yossi HaKohen." She was a Kohen. He lived in Israel. Shaholach Acha Rabbi. He followed his rabbi L'Tzaydon to a place in Chutz La'aretz called Sidon, to learn Torah. So this is the brisa. V'Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, "Halacha Rabbi Yossi. Halacha is like Rabbi Yossi." Now, apparently Rabbi Yochanan knew of this brisa and he commented on this brisa. But if he held of this brisa, take a look at the first part of the brisa. You're allowed to purchase from them slaves and servants and fields and etc. Even though the product, we can assume that part of the profits are going to go to the church. It's the Yorid Shel Goyim, and they're celebrating a holiday. So how does Rabbi Yochanan say that you're not allowed to do such a thing? Here it seems like the anonymous opinion that you could do such a thing. Rabbi Yochanan will tell you that this price is loyalty. It's not an argument. You're not allowed to buy something from a store if you know the profit will go towards the church. Like kasha, but this price is not difficult. When it's also if you're buying from a regular merchant, because he's giving part of his profits to the church. If you're buying from a private individual on a Craigslist or eBay, he's not taking and giving his profits to the church, then it's permitted. So Amar Mar, we learned previously, behema, if you bought an animal, if you bought an animal, you could uproot, you have to maim the animal. Where did we say that? We said that before. Rab Nosson said in Rab Nosson's brisa, if you're forced to buy from a shuk of Avodah Zarah, the brisa said previously on top of the page, if you bought an animal, you should maim the animal. So you certainly can't make it a treifa. The ezo hu ikar. How do you maim an animal? You cut the hind legs from the knee downwards. Says the Gemara Minu. I'll ask you a contradiction. One is not allowed to make a donation to the Beis Hamikdash b'zman hazeh. Basically, do kegdish, haramim, or erechim, where you're donating to the Bed Kabayas. If you did all that, since we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, if you keep it around, you might benefit from it, and you're moil behegdish. So behema, if it's an animal, take care. You have to maim the animal. Peres, ksusa kelem, if it's fruits, clothing, or utensils, yerakhu, you should make it rot. In other words, don't benefit from it because again, don't keep it around your house. Because you may put on the suit. Or clay matches, and if it's a metal keli, so then it'll never rot, right? It'll never rust or rot. Throw it into the Yam HaMelech. Now, the Brisa says what is called a maiming the animal or making it unusable. It's not that you're keeping it alive. Noel Dels now, you close it, you lock it in a barn and starve it to death. And it dies by itself. So we see that if you can't benefit from an animal, you try to kill it by starving it to death. And how does our Brisa says, no, you don't starve it to death. You just take off the hind legs from the knee downwards. Rabbi, it depends. Shanu Hasam over there, it's different since it's hektish, mishum bizyon conducted. We don't want it to walk around with maimed legs and it'll live for a long time. This is a disgrace for something that is holy. So therefore, they came up with another idea when it's dealing with something that's holy, kachi bedek abayis, then something that is holy, they actually take the animal and starve it to death. But if it's an animal that you purchased on the market of Avodah Zarah, then you don't have to starve it to death. You just cut the hind legs off. Says the Gemara of Mishcha, let's shecht it. Why did we have to close? Why do we have to starve it to death by the kache bedek abayis? Let's slaughter it. And says the Gemara, also the kala, it'll become to a stumbling block. If it's kosher meat, you might eat it. Says the Gemara of Lishve Gistra, then just chop it in half. Abai said, Amakra, the pasuk says, you chop down their altars and break them in half. You're not supposed to do something that is kachim. Don't follow the same idea for kachim. So it's more of a degradation, a lav, that one is not allowed to cut an animal in half and destroy an animal that way. So the best way is just lock it into a barn and let it starve to death. Rava says like this: the reason why we don't, by the kachim, we don't allow you to name the animal, because by kachim, it looks like you're putting a blemish on kachim, and there's a pasuk that says kol mum lo yiyah. You're not allowed to make a mum. If you have an animal that could potentially be used onto the mizbeach, you're not allowed to put a blemish on there. So that's why it looks like you're mato a blemish. Says the Gemara, near it looks like if you're chopping the hind legs off, mumal yehi, then you're putting an actual blemish on this animal. So why did Rava use this expression shenira? Rava used it looks like you're going to putting a mum, a blemish in kachim. And says the Gemara, when is it also to take the legs off, take part of the legs off, bisman shebeis hamikdash kayim? When the Beis Hamikdash was around, when this animal could potentially be used as a service, as a sacrifice, the chazir la'akrava. Nowadays, when we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, we have no sacrifice. There wouldn't be a problem to put a blemish on the animal. It's only Isid Rabbonon that they said, hey, we don't want you to put a blemish on this animal since it's kachim, so we'd rather have you take it into a barn and starve it to death. Mind you, by the way, I just want to mention that all the time that we said about that you buy Avodah Zarah, if you bought on the open market during Avodah Zarah day, you maim the animal, you maim it in such a way that it doesn't become a treifa. To make an animal a treifa is asur, because you're causing it to die fast. So you just maim it in such a way so that it has a blemish which it makes it unusable for work. Says the Gemara of Laheve Kematul Mum Babal Mum to Afichav Lo Chazi Lakrava Asa. So even let's consider it that if there's no Beis Hamikdash, we consider it that the animal's already blemished. As a healthy animal, it's a blemished animal because you can't bring it up as a sacrifice, and therefore, if you're going to blemish it. You're putting a blemish on top of a blemish. That's also b'drabanan. And let's say an animal during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, a sacrifice got a blemish. You're not allowed to make another blemish. Once it's already also maybe make another blemish. You're not allowed to add a blemish to a blemish, because that's also b'drabanan. So why did Rava say it looks like you're putting a mum, an initial mum in this type of kachim, since this kachim wasn't anyway appropriate, it wasn't set up to bring on to the sacrifice because there is no Beis Hamikdash. So Rava should have said it's like putting a mum in another bal mum. You're adding a blemish to an existing blemish. Even though originally you could not bring it as a healthy animal as a sacrifice, also it's also to make another blemish on an animal that already is blemished that cannot be brought as a sacrifice. So why Rava says it looks like you're putting an initial blemish onto this kachim. Answers the Gemara, a blemish, if an animal during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, if it has a blemish, you can't bring this animal as a sacrifice, but you could redeem the animal. So therefore, during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, you weren't allowed to add another blemish to an existing blemish, to a blemish that already existed onto an animal that was worthy of a sacrifice, since this animal you could redeem and take the money and bring another sacrifice. In this case, there is no isser at all to put a blemish on it, because you can't redeem it because there is no Beis Hamikdash, and you certainly can't bring this animal up onto the Beis Hamikdash as a sacrifice. Can't redeem it and buy another animal because there is no Beis Hamikdash. So Rava used the language, it looks like you're putting a mum in kachim, an initial mum in kachim. We don't, everybody knows that this was a holy animal, albeit you can't bring, there's no Beis Hamikdash. So we didn't want you to maim the animal. We'd rather you use the idea of lock it into a barn and it starves by itself. Says the Gemara. The Gemara says like this: Ashke Rabbi Yoina Rabbi Eloi dekoya pischei ditzar. Rabbi Yoina found Rabbi Eloi that was on the door of the city of Tzur, someplace in the north. And Amalei, so Rabbi Yoina said to Rabbi Eli, you have to maim an animal. If you buy an animal during the days of Avodah Zarah on the market, with the goyim are celebrating an Avodah Zarah, that is aser to do. So the Gemara wants to know. So the question is, during the market fair, can one purchase a slave? Eved Mao, can I purchase a slave? Do I have to, what do you do with an eved like that? If you purchased a slave and now you're not allowed to benefit because, let's say the profit is going to the church, and you bought a slave. Let's say you bought a slave. What should you do with that slave? How do you maim a slave? So the Eved Yisrael, if you bought a Jewish slave like Mabayale, of course you're not allowed to maim a Jewish person. Kika Mabayale, my question is, Eved Goy. If you bought a Goyish Eved, a Gentile Eved, am I allowed to maim this Eved? See, if I buy an animal, you maim the animal, make it unusable. So maybe if you buy a Goyish slave on the market, and the profit of the Goyish slave went to the church, and so therefore you're not allowed to benefit, maybe you should break the legs of the Goy. Malay, so Rabbi Lai said, what kind of question is this? Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Hagoyim, if you have a Goy, Vaharoya Behema Daka, or a Gazlan, shepherd that who's a known thief, because the shepherds used to steal food and graze the animals into private property. So if they fall into a pit, loy malin, you don't have to help them save their life. You see, a guy falls into a pit, you don't have to save his life. But for loy maridin, you're not allowed to kick him into the pit. So therefore, physically to do something to the guy, you're not permitted to do. Very strange question. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zeir. So Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zeir, Ketani, we learned in the Mishnah, loy kemehem behema avodah mishpachas. You're allowed to purchase from them animals, slaves, and maids. In other words, as Rabbi Yochanan explained, that brisa, the second brisa, is discussing that if you're buying from a private person, not where the profits go to the church, you're allowed to buy animal, slaves, and maids. So what does it mean if you're buying from a private person? And again, this is the day of the holiday, so you really shouldn't be doing business with them. But this causes them pain by selling you a slave. So Eved Yisrael, did the Brisa mean you're only allowed to buy a Jewish slave? Or maybe Efila Eved Goy, even a Goyish slave. Oh, so what's the din with that? Are you allowed to buy a Goyish slave during their holiday on Malay? So Reb Zera answered Reb Yirmiyah, Mestabra Eved Yisrael. You're only allowed to buy a Jewish slave. The Eved Goy, because if you're buying a Goyish slave, Lamai Mibayle, why would you need that? Why would you need that? So it would hardly imagine that you would actually want a Goyish slave in your house. So therefore, we did not allow you to buy from a private individual, even on the day of their holiday, a Goyish slave, only a Jewish slave. Also, Ravin, Rav Shimon Lakish, he said a fascinating thing. Rav Shimon Lakish says, you're allowed to even buy from a goy, a fila eved goy, even a goyish slave. Why? Because if you bought a Goyish slave, because eventually you're going to make that Goyish slave a Jew. Because once you buy a Goyish slave, he has to take on the mitzvahs that a woman are bechuyev in, are obligated in. So therefore, it's almost like you're buying an extra Jew. So because of that, Rav Shimon Lakish permitted you to buy even Goyish slave. Remember, you're not allowed to do business with a guy on their holiday, but if it causes them pain because they're selling something that they really like, you're allowed to buy it with that from them, even on their holiday. So a house, you're allowed to buy off them, or the Mishnah says, the Brisa says even a slave. And Rish Lakish says you can even buy a goyish slave off them. But Ravashi disagreed. He said, when you buy an animal from them, are you bringing and making the animal a ger? No, it's only because you're going to use the animal. Elam shmutayu, because he loses out by selling you a good animal, and you have a good use for it, a financial use for it, a productive use for it. Only if when you're buying a slave, it causes him a somewhat of a loss. When you're buying a goyish slave off him, goyish slaves are generally lazy people, and therefore you're actually, unburdening him, so not to have to support this goyish slave, because sometimes you buy a goyish slave, and it costs you more to feed them between the work that they're actually doing. Maybe they're part of a union or something. So therefore, Ravashi was of the opinion that you're not allowed to buy a goyish slave. The only time is you're allowed to buy a Jewish slave to make him come part of a Jewish home. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yaakov Zvan Sandala. Rabbi Yaakov purchased sandals in the carnival fair, the market fair, on the day that they had a holiday for the Avodah Zarah. Rabbi Yirmiyah, Zav, and Peter bought bread. Amalei Chad Chavre. So and they knew that some of the profits are going toward. They thought that some of the profits are going towards. Each one thought about the other that he did wrong, because the profits, he thought, are going to go towards the church. So Rabbi Yaakov once said to his friend, Rabbi Yaakov said to Rabbi Yirmiyah, Yasman Abed Rabbi Chachni, you orphan, you have no one to ask. Would your rabbi have allowed you to buy bread? And Rabbi Yirmiyah asked Rabbi Yaakov, would your rabbi Rabbi Yochanan allow you to buy sandals? They both were allowed to do it, says the Gemara. They bought it from a private individual off an eBay site or a Craigslist. So therefore, that person wasn't giving his profit to the church. Each one thought the other one bought it from a actual merchant, a licensed merchant. So therefore, each one thought the other one did an avera. The Rabbi Abba, son of Rabbi Kiva, said, the only isser is buying from a merchant who's going to give part of his taxes to the church, the shakli miximine, because they take a tax off him. If you're buying from a private individual, that he's not taking off the taxes, mutter, you're permitted to buy. Concludes the Gemara. So therefore, they didn't do anything wrong. Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Yirmiyah. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Abba Bered Rabbi Barabba. Ilimoli hoy Rabbi Yochanan ha zimna ba'asur de kashakli michsa afilim balabayis ha ba'asur. If Rabbi Yochanan was one time in our city that saw that most people are giving taxes towards the church, he wouldn't even prohibited you buying from an individual, mibalabayis, a private individual, lest you come to buy from a regular merchant. So had Rabbi Yochanan been alive, so the question is, maybe then Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Yirmiyah should not have bought at all, even if they bought from a private individual. They shouldn't have done that. Answers the Gemara, they bought maybe they purchased from an owner that doesn't really live there. He's just a passing person who takes up a temporary residence in that place, and he just opened a pop-up store or a private pop-up store, and therefore he certainly is not going to give any of his taxes, any of his profits to the church, and he's not sticking around. So he wouldn't be under the gezerah that you're not allowed to buy even from somebody who's a balabas living in the city, because he's a balabas, a owner that's not set to live there. He's just a temporary dweller. Okay, well, let's just do the Mishnah. Let's continue just to do the Mishnah, and then we'll stop. Mishnah continues, and the Mishnah says, Elu dvarim asur limkol goy. The following, you're not allowed to sell to a goy all year round. All year round, you're not allowed to sell these because you can be sure that they're going to use it for the Avodah Zarah. Utstru bolin. We're going to see what that is in the Gemara. Ubenai shiach is white figs. Upaitorais, we'll see what upaitorais, you're not allowed to sell that. Ulvaina, you're not allowed to sell frankincense. The Tanakol halovin, and white chickens, a white rooster. Rabbi Yehuda, because they were used for Avodah Zarah during the time of the Mishnayos. Rabbi Yehuda says, Minko limko loy tarnagoy lovim bein hatarnagoyim. If you're selling him a bunch of black or different colored chickens, and one of them happens to be completely white, a rooster that's completely white, then you're allowed to sell it. It's just selling him that hen that's only white as an individual sale. But if you're selling them a lot with mixed colors, then you can throw in a white one. If you're selling an individual hen, then you can cut off its finger, or you can sell it, because he's not going to use it as a sacrifice for his Avodah Zarah because it's missing a limb. So he's going to be careful not to use it. So that's because they don't sacrifice a live chicken that's a hen that's missing a limb for Avodah Zarah. Ushar kol advarim, any other item, stomach mutter. If he doesn't tell you why he's buying it, you're allowed to sell him. Uperushim, but if he comes to your store and says, I'm buying this flour for my Avodah Zarah, also, you're not allowed to sell it to him. Rabbi Meir says, Af dekel tav v'chatzav, these two items, strong palm tree and chatzav, we'll see what that is in the Gemara. Also, limka l'goyim, you're not allowed to sell to goyim because probably they were going to use that for an Avodah Zarah. So here the Mishnah says there are certain things you're never allowed to sell for an Avodah Zarah, for a guy, because he's going to for sure use it for his Avodah Zarah.